Now, to shed more light on the state of Nigeria's economy and the federal government's interventions in that regard, I've been joined here in our studios by the Director General of the Budget Office of the Federation, Mr. Ben Akabueze. Good evening to you, Mr. Akabueze. Welcome.
Thank you, Adi. Pleasure.
Let's look at this. I'm sure, of course, you listened to the previous discussion that took place between me and Mr. Iwane and Dr. Adedipe and Mr. Alaji, and of course the headwinds that have been faced by the economy, both internal and external, which would be a good rationale for interventions to ensure that things don't go completely off course. On a general note, how do you think that has gone?
Well, there's without a doubt, I mean, the economy faces significant challenges. But let me say this, that somehow, I mean, even in that discussion that took place, I didn't hear a lot about the real solution and the crux of the problem, that the Nigerian economy, faces. I mean, the public sector and government's fiscal operations, which is the fact that government is not generating nearly enough revenues as it requires. There's a lot of fixation on the expenditure side of things and, on debt and all of that. The reality is, first of all, as I've said repeatedly, our problem is not that as government, our government is spending too much money. The truth is, government is not spending enough money. And the numbers are there to show our public expenditure to GDP ratio is at the bottom, even on the African continent. And that's why, public services are suffering, whether it's in health or education. That's why the infrastructure, faces significant deficit. Okay. It is, however, correct that we can be more efficient in our expenditure. And how can we be more efficient? There's some waste, admittedly, that we still need to cut. Okay? And then, of course, we need to also then really do a better job of, prioritizing how we spend the limited resources that are available. That means also that we need to look at, take a hard look at, the subsidies, like the petrol subsidies, which is currently, the single largest item of expenditure out after personnel costs and perhaps debt service for the federal government. So these are the things that we need to really.
But then, if you say it that way, I guess maybe the next question, of course, when you say, okay, look, many people don't talk about the fact that we're not earning enough, we're not making enough. But usually, most governments, how they earn money is by taxing productive activities, and we're not producing, which was part of the subject of the last conversation. That we're not really producing. We're an import-driven economy, and therefore the question of the interventions, which I mentioned in introducing you, that is government coming in particular aspects of the economy to say, look, okay, look, we're not really doing so well here, but here's a direct intervention that may not necessarily be tied to economic conditions or allowing market forces to operate, but it's because you recognize that a lot of people are currently not producing, and if they're not producing, you can't tax them, and if you can't tax them, then the government doesn't make money.
Well, first of all, that's a fallacy, unless we don't believe the GDP numbers. The GDP is a measure of your domestic output. So whether you're importing or producing locally, and don't get me wrong, ideally you should produce as much as you can, domestically, and if you did, your GDP number will be higher than it is. But even the imports, even if all that you do is trade, trading should be taxed.
Why is
The
it not being
reality,
taxed?
well, that's the point. You know, the reality is, first of all, most countries of the world, the biggest source of government revenue is taxation. And even within taxation, personal income taxes. But in Nigeria, aggregate personal income taxes is still under ₦1 trillion. Okay. The way it works, personal income taxes is in the remit of the state governments in Nigeria. In other federations, you have federal, personal income tax, and you have state level income taxes. In Nigeria, all personal income tax is by the state. But we're talking about the Nigerian economy here, not the federal government. A lot of the states, a lot of the economic activity can be driven by the states. So when I talk about government being hampered by revenues, and when I talk about the low public sector revenue, because the public services that I spoke about, health, education, most of those really should be the remit of the state, government. But most of the states are not getting enough resources. So states, you'll have to go back to our history. Pre-colonial Nigeria and in the First Republic, taxation was the principal source of revenues for government. I have a theory that when the military intervened in their quest for legitimacy, they basically looked away from taxation, and their intervention coincided with, becoming a major oil producer and focused on basically funding government through resource rents. And that went on for decades. Now it's proving difficult to get back to the culture of taxation. A few states are doing better than others. I mean, last year now, Kaduna State has overtaken Delta State in terms of IGR, its internally generated revenues, because the government in Kaduna State is focused on in what needs to be done to drive to drive that. Many years ago, Kaduna was way below Delta State, for instance, in that. So I think that this also compounded by the fact that during the period when we focused on funding government by resource rents, the people were displeased by the value that they were getting from all of the resources. And so, positions have hardened in terms of a willingness to pay tax. And so there's massive tax, evasion. When you have a system where even our databases, now there's all kinds of biometric databases still not synced, and so people can actually be anonymous. There's no link between the property ownership records and the tax records, so you can't really tell whether the same guy precisely. So some guy shows up at the embassy, trying to justify his case for visa, and he's showing all of the assets that he owns, and then he has his tax clearance certificate. And the visa officer is saying, I can't match these two. The person who owns all of these cannot be the person who's paying this income, because the income that is declared for. So that's what, if you take, we're talking about, we say we're the largest economy on the continent measured by our GDP. And that's correct. And there are even those who argue that the GDP is currently undermeasured because of the massive informal sector that we have.
And which is not captured.
Which is not necessarily fully captured. That's the view that is held strongly. The dimension of that undermeasurement is debatable. But it takes South Africa. In South Africa, personal income taxes compared to Nigeria is multiples of what Nigeria.
So
more than 20 times what Nigeria earns. Indeed, okay, in Nigeria, there's only about 40 million people in the tax net. The top 1 million taxpayers in South Africa pay more taxes than all of the
rest.
All of the 40 million people in Nigeria who pay taxes. So we're not talking about taxing what doesn't exist. We're talking about taxing the income that exists. One of the slides that Mr. Rwane showed earlier on, that 2%, of Nigerians, that
yes.
top slice,
the sophisticated elite.
Yes, the income, the share of the income that they control is so huge that even if they were the only ones who paid tax and paid what was appropriate, we will be way ahead where we are currently in terms of tax collections.
Let me also bring you to something else, because of course, even if we were able to generate a lot of revenue and so on, then the issue of prioritization and allocation of such resources, which is where the budget and the budget office would probably come into play. And there are those, of course, there are always all those screaming headlines about double items in the budget and about provisions for items that have already been done, and that. So even if we leave out the issue of possible attempts to short-circuit the system, does it speak then to gaps within even the flow process of how the budget is prepared? I mean, you are in charge of the federal one, but one can take notice of some of the things you will say and probably apply them to the state levels as well. In terms of how budgets are prepared, I know that, I mean, elementarily, there used to be an envelope system, and then, of course, you had what they call the zero budget system, and then there were those there were some states who also took a hybrid of both. But do you think it has more to do with capacity, for example? Or is it that we are dealing with the wrong system for our own environment? Or perhaps it's more than that?
Well, let me start with the federal, government's budget that I currently have responsibility for. I think that sometimes all of those things are overhyped. If you take the federal government's budget for 2022, there are over 20,000 projects in that budget, okay? And it's not a perfect document. And there's no country's budget that is perfect. So if out of 20,000 projects, you found 200 that you label as duplications, does that suggest that people are not doing a good enough job? And even what we call duplications, okay? Sometimes in point of fact are not. So for instance, if you have the Rural Electrification Agency that has in its budget, say solar power projects, okay, in some communities in, say, Ekiti State. And then you go to the budget of the River Basin Development Authority, I think is a River Basin Development Authority that covers that area. And they also have solar power projects in some communities in Ekiti State. People say it's a duplication. But the point is to fully install solar power projects in those communities, you will need far more than the combination of the provisions made in those two budgets. And so at the point of implementation, there is a delimitation of which communities this agency is focusing on, which this agency is focusing on, because it's a procurement process. But those who look at the budget simply conclude that that is a duplication. You talked about the zero-based budget and the envelope system. I hear this all the time. The truth is, there is no budget system anywhere in the world that ultimately is not based on envelopes or ceilings. To do otherwise would be to engage in an exercise of wishful thinking, which budgeting is not. What is this envelope or ceiling? It simply establishes the fact that your resources are finite. The starting point in preparing a budget is to dimension the resources that are available to you. Those resources come principally from two sources: the revenues that you can generate and the debt that you plan to take. When you add the two, you have a finite amount of resources available. The starting point of the budget process is then to, apply a logical process to take that finite aggregate envelope and parcel it out as envelopes to the different sectors and the different ministries, departments, and agencies. What is then the zero-based budget is designed to substitute what was called incremental budgeting. An incremental budget simply says that once an item gets into the budget, it just stays there, in perpetuity. And every year, so people look at, last year we spent ₦1 billion. This year we just add we add 100 million, so it becomes 1.1. Zero-based budgeting says, in principle, that every year you have to justify the existence of that item anew in the budget. People see the same line or similar item in the budget year after year, and they just conclude that it's a repetition. But you see, take an agency that has 1,000 employees, and they've determined that they need 500 computers, for instance, to serve the 1,000 employees. But at the point of budgeting, due to resource constraint, they're told you can only get enough money to buy 100 computers this year. So what you see is that agency in year one will budget for 100 computers. In year two, you will see another 100 computers. For 5 years, you may be seeing 100 computers each year, which is simply to get them to the 500 computers that they need. It's not a repetition of the item. So there's a lot of uninformed commentary on the budget. And a lot of people don't even take the trouble of, reverting to the people who prepared the budget to ask questions before they go to town.
The other part of this, of course, is that your office and agencies which are in charge of the budget are supposed to work hand in hand with others in the course of the implementation process. So you have oversight, for example, Absolutely. Like with the National Assembly or with state assemblies for state governments and so on. This capacity or lack of understanding of the process that you just talked about, I mean, many of those who talk about these things or who raise, quote and unquote, the alarm are members of these other agencies. They only report to the media, which then tends to, instead of probably looking at it more soberly because, in many instances they're interested in numbers, just go out there with the story. But I'm wondering if at the base, those you're supposed to work with understand this thing that you've just said. Because at the end of the day, if they don't understand it, there's no way they can work with you in implementing it. And if they don't do that, then there will always be inefficiencies in the allocation process and then the implementation, won't there?
Well, I think that by and large, they do. One of the things that we need to fix, and currently, I think the bill scaled second reading, last week. Nigeria doesn't have an organic budget law like, most serious countries in the world would do. You have a budget law that clearly defines the processes for budgeting, the responsibilities and all of that, and, basically, even including the timetable, the hard timetable that sets the responsibilities and timelines for doing what. Okay? That law is only just currently in the making. So obviously, that will improve. One of the things that will also result in, hopefully, is create a budget officer cadre, a core of budget officers who will make their career in budgeting. From today, you don't have that. What you have is administrative officers. And that's why every year, to be able to prepare the budget office has to train over 4,000 officers across all of the MDAs to be able to prepare the budget. By the next year, most of those guys you've trained have moved on to other, they've been transferred to other functions or other agencies of government. So, that a skill is at an base, therefore isn't being really deepened as much as it should.
It's a tough one. I'm told I have just 1 minute to round this up. So I'm going to ask you this now, that given your experience and what we've discussed, if you were to set an agenda for people who are looking to take over administration in these twin areas in terms of the budgeting and in terms of raising the revenue profile, what have you found that would be something that they could look at that would work?
Well, as I said, raising our revenues is an existential, issue for us. As we do so, it will do two things: increase our capacity to spend and reduce our dependency on debt. There's been a lot of concern about, government borrowing, and justifiably so, because right now we're spending way too much in terms of percentage of our revenues in debt service, and that's really the challenge. But as you see, that goes back again to revenues. The reality is, if our revenues were growing as they ought to, our debt levels will not currently be a challenge. All over the world, post-COVID-19 resulted in $28 trillion of growth in public debt across the world. Public debt grew by 99%, grew to 99% of GDP on the average across the globe. The rate of growth in our debt didn't even get near the global average. But the problem is because of our weak revenues. And that's been compounded by the fact that if you look at the 2022 budget now, oil revenues accounts for just 22% of projected government revenues. In 2015, that was 57%, right. And it used to be as high as 20%. So one of the things we must do is fix, because as much as we desire to diversify away from oil, in interim, we need to fix the challenges in the oil sector so that, the revenue generating capacity of that sector for government can be restored. The significance of the oil sector goes beyond just its revenue generating capacity, because it remains our principal, foreign currency earner. And because of what you alluded to earlier, the import-dependent nature of our economy, most of the other sectors, manufacturing, whatever, even agriculture, because the inputs, the machinery and all of that still, are still imported, are heavily import-dependent, and so they rely on that foreign exchange. So, again, you talk about inflation. As you heard from the other panel, a lot of inflation we're experiencing is passed through imported inflation. Yeah. If we earned a lot more dollars, which right now is only the oil sector that can immediately give us that bump that we need. Today, our OPEC quota is 1.8 million barrels of crude per day. We have capacity to produce condensate, an average of 300 1,000 barrels per day. That is not even counted in the, so technically we could be doing 2.1, 2.2 million barrels, but today we're doing, just barely over 1 million barrels. Imagine what if we restored to that sector and ramped up production, what an extra 1 million, barrels of could do, for government revenue, for foreign exchange. And that's the only way you can get the people make the exchange rate is not something you wish. the exchange rate is a price for that, you call your currency, and it obeys the forces of demand and supply.
Indeed.
If the supply of dollars to this economy increases,
then of course
the Naira will strengthen. If it doesn't, the Naira will weaken.
Indeed. Mr. Akabueze, I wish we could go on because there's quite a bit that you've mentioned, which is a lot to chew, but let me thank you for your time on this Independence Day. Mr. Ben Akabueze, of course, is in charge of the Budget Office of the Federation. He's the Director General. Thank you for your time on the program this evening.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.